So I want to welcome in Steve Kortyka. This is a brand new series, just talking about vocabulary. And really, what I wanted to do is pick the brains of some of my favorite players. So Steve was one of the first people that came to mind. And Steve, you're on the inaugural episode of this vocabulary stuff. So thanks for doing this, man.
It's an honor to be here, man. And I love your playing as well too. So if I ever get around to doing the same thing, I'm definitely going to include you on that list as well, man.
Beautiful. I love it.
Yeah.
So the first question that I kind of have for you to sort of get us into this topic of vocabulary is vocabulary something that you're working on sort of day in and day out and you're practicing? Like is it an everyday thing that you're focusing on?
Yeah. Short answer to that is definitely yes. I think I used to actively work on like incorporating new language, and that has evolved over the years. So now what I try to do is just play a tune every day and allow whatever comes up in my improvisation through that song to be my my guiding force or my vocabulary study for that day. And that could be a variety of things, and it's a little bit more esoteric than it used to be. I used to just be like, okay, I'm going to learn this sharp 11 sound as part of a 2/5, or I'm
Mm.
going to learn this idea in all 12 keys, and then get really good uh, control over that idea and be able to play it around the horn in various ways, which is still something I do, but not as often as just playing now. I try to make it much more organic, and when I find these things that I like or that I'm looking for, that's when I'll stop maybe and hit the pause button on the tune that I'm working on and be like, okay, well, what is that? How does that fit into that particular chord that's tripping me up or something like that? But it's a great question with a lot of different answers, as I'm sure
Yeah.
we'll find out as this develops. But for right now, yeah, that's my process right now is mostly just shedding tunes and allowing the roadblocks that I come up to along the way to teach me the vocabulary that I want to learn.
Yeah, and I love that idea of like using a chord progression, using a tune to sort of dictate, what you're going to work on. Because I find one of the things that my students get stuck by is like, all right, well, if I'm going to take a line and learn it all 12 keys, great. But what am I going to do with that? Like, I'm not going to be able to remember that line when I'm, playing over a tune or whatever. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's so far removed from the actual act of improvising.
Hmm.
I love that idea of using the tune as the impetus for like what to work on.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I used to be very much that way, and I never necessarily had a teacher telling me like you have to learn all these licks and all 12 keys, but in my head I thought that was like the gateway into being a great player. And I certainly now know lots of players that can play things in all 12 keys, but they might not be fluent, what I would consider like fluent improvisers, or
Yeah.
they might not be, they might not know how to play over a certain chord progression really well. Uh, and what they're doing, actually learning something in all 12 keys is in some ways harder than
Right.
learning how to play over giant steps or learning how to play a blues or whatever. So, uh, separating those things in your mind is, I think, really important. It's like having a great reason for learning something in all
Mm.
12 keys versus, just practicing. I think people tend to make it a lot more complicated than it is. The idea of like learning vocabulary, and because you don't see the results, if you practice a tune for 20 minutes one day and you pick it up tomorrow and you don't really feel like you got any better at it, but you did. I think a lot of people forget to improvise uh, as their goal of becoming a better improviser. They forget that you actually have to improvise to
Yeah.
do that. So
And in fact, that's sometimes like a big fear, right? It's like, well, I could work on theory all day. I can play
mhm.
this lick that I, took from a John Coltrane solo. But then sometimes where people freeze up is like, oh, now I have to actually improvise, right?
Yeah,
So I love that you said that because that can actually be the major hang up for a lot of people that uh that's the part they don't want to do, or that's the part that like makes them start sweating.
yeah, and it's the part with the least tangible results. I think you can't really monitor how much better you're getting or like what you actually learned by doing it, but the the thing that's great about it is there's so many things that are getting better at the same time. You wouldn't necessarily need to monitor it because I mean, for me now, I feel like as long as I'm just doing that, like just shedding tunes, my vocabulary is going to get better, you
Right.
know. And I don't always know what it is. Like I said, like it's just it's shows up in a variety of different ways.
Right
Um,
on.
but yeah,
Cool. So if I were to getting a little bit more specific, right? If I were
totally.
to walk in on your practice session today,
Mhm.
what would you be working on when it comes to vocabulary? So like, is it a tune that you've been working on? Is it a particular sound over a particular tune? Like, what does it look like a snapshot right now for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple of things I just like to run through is I have like a running list of songs that I'm working on and songs that I think people are gonna like. You know, not
Okay.
necessarily songs that are gonna impress my jazz friends. Songs that if I got called to play a gig that I would play for the audience and they would really like it, and it would be great for the band and the audience. So
Okay.
that's one thing. So on that list, you know, I have like I really like Evidence, the monk tune,
Mm,
because it's got a cool rhythmic thing in it, and the chord progression is just a great chord progression. So I would just maybe shed that tune for 20 minutes or something, make sure I know the melody, and then just start soloing over the tune. And one of the things I've been working on is like trying to incorporate melodic cells into a chord progression. So
okay.
once I feel like I'm just playing the changes really well to the tune, I'll try and play things outside of what the changes are, but that are related to things that fit in the changes. If that
Okay.
if that makes any
Yeah,
sense.
totally.
Yeah,
So like taking an idea that might have come to your mind really naturally and trying to flip it a different way.
yeah, yeah. So that there's like a line of conversation happening within what I'm playing. So like to give you like a example playing wise, I'm just gonna solo over like the first 8 bars
Okay.
of the tune, and then for the first A section, I'm going to play just as inside of the changes as I can, and then the second A section, I'm going to try and use melodic cells in a motivic way, but still like kind of thinking inside of the changes at the
Okay.
same time, you know.
Sweet.
So. Uh, so
Man.
like
Man.
the second one, there's a lot of chromaticism or whatever happening,
Yeah.
but it's not necessarily worrying about whether the changes are correct or not.
Right.
Um, but in order to do that well and to have it be convincing, I have to make sure I really know the changes first.
Mm.
So I'll practice playing perfect bebop for a little while, and then gradually, just with whatever tune I'm working on, I kind of just try and get away from that and practice having control over getting a little bit different sounds in there that make everybody can do this, and it's definitely a thing that we all need to exercise in order to get good at. But that's what makes everybody sound like themselves, is like not how well you can play inside the changes, but I think how well you can deviate from what the inside is. And that's just my opinion. A lot of people, you get your purists out there that are very much about, don't do any of that stuff. The art
Hmm.
form is playing inside of the changes.
Ah.
I don't necessarily follow that advice, because it's just more fun for me to not
Right.
have so many rules, and feel like you have to do everything a specific way all the time.
That's beautiful. So when you take a cell, are you practicing or do you practice outside of the tune, like taking a cell and moving it um, in a predetermined way, I guess? Like so you're doing some chromatic stuff, right? Like taking a cell and moving it chromatically. Or another example would be like taking a cell and moving it in minor thirds, or like whatever it might be.
Mhm.
Is that something that you kind of work on outside of the context of a tune so that you're like ready to pull that off in real time?
Yes, it used to be a pretty big part of my practice session of doing, pentatonics that way, or learning a line. I have this thing called the grid that is part of this video course I'm about to put out, called the Melodic Cell Workbook.
Beautiful.
And yeah, I'm really excited to get that one out there because it was just such it's a compilation of my whole practice regimen, basically up until like last month or so. So like
Awesome.
I
Awesome.
kind of started from when my big aha moment with learning language, I think, was when I heard Kenny Garrett play live in a master class, and this was like around 2001, and he was, kind of in the uh, just like his heyday, for lack of a better word. He was just
Yeah.
on fire. Everything he played was amazing, and I kind of just could hear through his practicing that he was just taking things and just learning them just all over the horn.
Mm.
And for me, like the grid that I mentioned is half steps. You just take an idea, do it in half steps, do it in whole steps, minor thirds, major thirds, fourths, tritones, and then perfect fifths.
Cool.
And don't necessarily feel like you have to do all of that every day, but doing it in one of those modes of transposition and just making sure you hit all 12 keys is going to give you that intro to flexibility to where you can start to move it around to a lot of different places. So, like the one line that I was repeating, so like that's whole steps. It's just
Right.
arpeggiating the minor seventh chord to this, and then going down to the sixth.
Yeah.
But just with that one idea, you can get a lot of different things happening with that. So
Yeah.
um, that's kind of the theme of that video course is going to be, is like getting the most information out of just a small piece of information, which is kind of I think the reason people got into melodic cells is because you realize, there's a lot of different things you can do with just, a small amount of notes.
Right. And see it like feeling like I can do the most with a small piece of information. It like makes me feel better. It makes me feel a lot less intimidated than like, oh, I gotta keep learning these like, four measure lines every day and putting them through all 12 keys and stuff like that. It's like, oh, I could just take
Yeah.
a cell and kind of manipulate it in all these different ways.
hmm
Yeah.
And I'm sure you have students like that as well. Like, what do you say to your students to get them to improvise when they have that roadblock? I'm just curious what you've
Yeah.
said in the past, because I definitely have a couple students now, and it's sort of a similar struggle where I'm just like, you just spend more time soloing, like
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
feel like you have to get it all in this practice session.
Right. And I think like getting used to every day improvising, like
hmm
making an improvised statement is sort of step one. And just through that process, you're going to actually start to figure out some of your own language, right?
Yeah.
And if you take something really simple, like, a pentatonic scale over the blues or a pentatonic scale over rhythm changes, it's kind of impossible if you're working on it consistently not to reach for some different things,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, you always kind of it's funny, you reach that state of mental exhaustion, I guess, if you've done it for too long in that one day. But then when you get to it the next day, you're not exhausted anymore, and then there's probably some new things that are floating around in there, which,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's just such a rewarding process. It's funny, the more that I do this, you'd think that you'd get sick of playing the same stuff, or
Hmm.
working on the same things, but as long as you're creative with it and improvising and including that in your practicing, there's not really any reason to get burnt out, I don't think. It's
Totally.
for me at least. But we're like biased saxophone
Right.
junkies, so to speak, so that's
It's true, but I
part
feel
of
like
it.
the path to becoming that saxophone and jazz junkie is like to just keep coming back to it every day. It's like you
hmm
start to taste that next level, and then you're like, "Ah, I don't want to stop until I get there."
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
So you mentioned a little bit about this already too, but like, how has the process changed over the years? You mentioned that back in the day you would take something through all 12 keys and kind of do that part of it. Um, any like interesting epiphanies or like steps along the path that really changed the way that you see the process or use the process in the practice room?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question, because everybody's at their own, stage of development. So like, it's a great one to see how they got to where they are. But for me, yeah, definitely, I definitely learned things in all 12 keys, and learned like just stock 2-5-1 ideas, or learned a solo, and learning in a couple different key centers was also a really helpful thing. The two things that with language for me that really stood out the most that were just really important is one, when you're transcribing a solo, make sure you know the changes
Okay.
of what the solo is being played over. Because a couple of the first solos I did, and even when I look back through my notebooks from like, when I was in undergrad, I wouldn't write the chord changes and I would learn the solo maybe really, really great, but I wouldn't spend any time soloing over that song or
Mm.
even paying attention to what the changes to that song were. So the language that I was learning kind of had it found its place in my head somewhere, but it wasn't going to connect to any of the things that I knew about theory or harmony. So
Okay.
when I went back and looked through some of those solos, or when I finally figured out that I needed to be doing that, I was able to take something that somebody played like so much more quickly and apply it to my own improvisations.
Mm.
But yeah, just making sure that you are familiar with the tune that you're transcribing the solo over. I
Yeah.
think that was a really big revelation for me. And then one of the other things that happened, and I realized this in like a lesson I had in undergrad also, is the idea that you have to sing everything you can play. Um, it goes both ways. So you might actually learn how to hear new things by playing them first, and
Mm.
then you can sing them.
Mm.
Uh, so the idea that you have to sing everything is sure, it's great. It's great to know how to sing something before you can play it, but I think playing complicated things can open up your oral pathways to hearing those things so that you can sing them as well. So some of the things like hearing the sharp nine or something like that, or being able to sing it and actually know how to use it, like just that note at the top. That note, I don't think that was anything I would have been able to conceive if I had just tried to use my voice to
Right.
sing the sharp nine. But
Yeah.
learning it as a part of a line, and I don't remember exactly where I learned the line from. I think it was actually from like a bass solo on a Jazz at Lincoln Center
Oh, cool.
thing that I heard. Yeah, Take the A Train
Nice.
that they did, and yeah, I heard it there and just learned how to play it, and then I was able to, I can hear the sharp nine much more clearly from that whole process.
Man, beautiful. I love those 2 points, and man, that's giving me a lot to think about definitely in the practice room. Like that thing about singing, because I think we think about as saxophone players, the singing thing is like so intimidating sometimes. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like I don't want to sing ever. I do it because I know the value of it, but
Mhm.
I love the way you sort of frame that as like, well, use the saxophone too, especially if you can get around it.
Yeah, don't feel like you have to sing everything just right off the bat. I mean, all these rules sometimes they come out, and different teachers can be more intimidating or less intimidating about it. But I try to approach everything from, do what works the best for you, and
Right.
then know that it would be ideal to be able to sing everything, of course, but don't feel like you should just not learn something if you can't sing it. That's because there's just certain things that, I mean, our voices are really, my voice is horrible. I have about
So is
an
mine,
octave.
yeah.
Yeah. I have about an octave range on a good day, and there's just so many things that are limiting because of that alone. So, yeah.
Awesome, man. Such great information. So I got one last question for you, just to kind of wrap things up. So, is there any advice that you could give to somebody that maybe like found this video or this podcast, and the reason that they found it is because they're furiously searching YouTube, like how can I learn jazz vocabulary like effectively? And it's because they're dejected and I'm never going to be able to do this. Like, what would be your advice to that person that's just kind of like at their wits' end?
Yeah. Wow. That's great. I guess yeah, the frustrating element definitely happens to all of us from time to time. But I would say the frustration is what leads us to the next level that we're going for. So if they found this video, they probably already got some information out of it, hopefully. But um, j- just trust the process. Trust your brain's ability to learn what you're putting into it,
Okay.
and pay attention to what you're putting into it. So like if the reason that jazz vocabulary is not making sense, it's probably because you're not really trying to put new sounds into your head in a meaningful way. And that, I think that always goes back to learning tunes and learning, it's, even if you have to take a step back and learn just one chord in a tune, have it be related to a song that you're trying to learn. And if you listen to the pros play those songs and you listen to yourself play that song, listen to recordings of yourself, you're going to, to always just be thinking of new things to play. And I think the frustration is like when you first hear like awesome players play, you're like, I want to sound like that. I want to sound like that. I sound cheesy, or I sound my articulation will never get that good, or something like that. But that's the first step to getting it. And your vocabulary, whether everybody realizes it or not, everybody has a vocabulary. It just could be very limited. But when you see like a G minor chord, even if you're just playing the arpeggio, that's the G minor on tenor. That's your language for that chord so far. So you have 4 great notes that work over that chord. So then improvise with just that information. There's nothing wrong with using small amounts of information and starting there with the arpeggios of the chords and then moving on to other things. But don't give up, whoever you are. I will say, because it's really fun. The more things that you get together and the more time that you spend just actively trying to figure things out, the more enjoyment you'll have overall.
That is very, very beautifully put, man. I love that. I love that.
Thanks.
So you mentioned that you're about to put out this video course. When's that going to be available? Where can people find it?
It's going to be on my website. I'm starting. I had mentioned that I was working on trying to rebuild my website, and I'm kind of in the middle of that process right now. As soon as I figure that out, that's going to be one of the first things I put on there. But it's going to be called the Melodic Cell Workbook, and it's just kind of a step-by-step, like a 7-step process. It's a little bit of a long video series, but it will take you less time to watch all the videos than it would to take a lesson with me, and it'll be cheaper than taking a lesson with me. So
beautiful. There's
just tons of stuff in there that you're going to be able to use forever in there. But yeah, just keep an eye out for it on stevekortyka.com. And in the meantime, if you have any other questions about stuff, I have a lot of tutorials on my website, the current website, and just resources. One of them actually is on building vocabulary. There's one thing I did want to talk about. It's kind of related to my message to the person about to give up, but just shedding tonalities one chord at a time. One of the resources I have is totally centered around that, and it was really just a mind opener for me, I guess. Is just the idea that you can just take one chord, zoom in on that one particular chord, and build tons of vocabulary just from that one thing. But really just trying to play, going back to the G minor, just really exhaust all the things that you know on a particular chord at any time. So so I do it until basically I run out of breath, and try and, if there's a concept that comes into my ear as I'm doing that, then trying to shed that. And for the longest time, before I did that, I was always just practicing 2/5s in the context of time.
Yeah.
And focusing them on like short 2/5 or long 2/5, and then you only really get to 2 beats or 4 beats to play a chord, or sometimes 8 beats on a nice long 2/5. So giving yourself those extra 4 or 5 measures, or extra 100 measures over a tonality is definitely gonna knock some stuff loose in the old brain as well. So
that's awesome.
That's all.
Yeah, taking it out of context sometimes can be like a magic bullet almost, right? Because we're always so like rigid. This is in 4/4 and it lasts for 1 beat. Is this a short 2/5? Is this a long 2/5? We don't really get as far as we could go if we're always like working inside those parameters, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So everybody should go follow Steve on Instagram as well. You're always putting out awesome stuff over there. I'll leave links to everything that Steve does in the description below this video. I just want to say thanks, Steve. This has been awesome.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I look forward to catching all the other great interviewees that you're about to do, no doubt.